Easton Greyfield was the kind of man who walked into a room and everyone went quiet, not out of respect but out of fear. Sharp jaw, cold gray eyes, a presence that made the air feel heavier the moment he appeared. On paper, he was the CEO of Greyfield Holdings, one of the most powerful real estate empires in the Midwest. But behind closed doors, behind the bulletproof glass of his penthouse on the 47th floor overlooking Lake Michigan, he was something else entirely, something no newspaper would ever print. He was a man who'd built his fortune on deals made in the dark, and he protected that fortune the way a wolf protects its den, with teeth. But here's what nobody knew about Easton Greyfield. The thing he protected more fiercely than any safe or any secret was his twin daughters, Zoe and Maddie, 4 years old, blonde curls, big blue eyes, and the only two people on earth who could make this man smile. And then there was her, Catalina Herrera, the live-in nanny, young but carrying the kind of weariness that only comes from a lifetime of being left behind. She wasn't like anyone else in that house. She didn't come from money. She didn't come from connections. Truth is, she didn't come from anywhere at all. Orphaned at 6, bounced through 7 foster homes before she turned 17, worked her way through college on a scholarship only to find out that a degree doesn't mean much when you've got no family, no references, and no one in this world willing to vouch for you. But Catalina had something that no amount of money could buy. She had dignity, quiet, unshakable dignity, the kind that doesn't announce itself but you feel it the moment she walks into a room. She'd been with the Greyfield family for 2 years now, and in that time she'd become more than a nanny. She'd become the only warmth those 2 little girls had ever known since their mother died during childbirth. She read to them every night. She wrote down every new word they learned in a small notebook she kept by her bed. She sang them lullabies in Spanish, the same ones her mother used to sing before she lost her, and she loved those girls, not because it was her job, but because for the first time in her entire life, Catalina Herrera felt like she belonged somewhere. So when Easton Greyfield stepped through the door of his private office that afternoon, 3 hours ahead of schedule, and saw his personal safe wide open, stacks of cash spread across the floor, a loaded handgun in his 4-year-old daughter's hands, and his nanny kneeling right there in the middle of it all, he didn't ask questions. He didn't wait for an explanation. In his mind, the scene was already complete. Betrayal, theft, and the one person he'd trusted with his children had just become the most dangerous person in his house. But here's the thing, he was wrong. He was completely and devastatingly wrong. And the decision he was about to make in the next 60 seconds would nearly cost him everything. Not his money, not his empire, but something far more valuable, something he didn't even know he had until it was almost gone. If you've ever judged someone before giving them a chance to speak, if you've ever let your pride make a decision that your heart would have made differently, then this story is going to hit you right where it matters. Make sure you hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what comes next. Now let's go back to that penthouse on the 47th floor. Back to the moment Easton Greyfield's eyes locked onto the woman kneeling beside his daughters, and everything he thought he knew was about to fall apart. No one said a word. That was the most terrifying part. Easton Greyfield stood in the doorway of his study, and the silence coming from him weighed more than anything he could have said out loud. It wasn't the silence of a man still thinking. It was the silence of a man who'd already finished. Catalina lifted her head and looked at him. Her hand was still resting on the lid of the safe, caught in the act of putting the stacks of cash back inside. She parted her lips to speak, but there was something in those cold gray eyes that made every word freeze right there against her mouth. There was no anger in them. Not yet. Only calculation. And with a man like Easton Greyfield, calculation was always 100 times more dangerous than rage. He walked into the room. Slowly, one step at a time. The soles of his leather shoes struck the oak floor like the ticking of a countdown clock. Zoe sat on the rug and looked up at her father with a radiant smile. "Daddy." But Easton didn't look at his child. His gaze stayed locked on Catalina, and when he finally spoke, his voice was so low it was almost nothing more than breath. "You opened my safe." It wasn't a question. It was a sentence already passed. Catalina swallowed hard. "Mr. Greyfield, the girls watched you enter the code. You opened my safe." Each word fell like its own separate bullet. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Men who were truly dangerous never had to raise their voices, because everyone around them already knew what happened when they stayed silent for too long. Easton pulled out his phone and dialed a single number. Flynn. Get up here. Take the girls out of the room. His voice never changed. Calm, controlled. And that, more than anything, was what made Catalina feel real fear for the first time in the 2 years she'd lived under this roof. Not because she was afraid for herself, but because she realized he was sending the girls out before saying what he really wanted to say. While waiting for Flynn, Easton stepped toward the gun, lying on the floor, less than a meter from Catalina. He bent down and picked it up. Checked it. His finger brushed across the safety and stopped. The safety was on. Someone had switched the safety on. He looked at Catalina. She looked back at him. And in those gray eyes, she saw something change. Not less anger, but a new layer of suspicion. Deeper and far more dangerous. Because in Easton Greyfield's mind, an ordinary nanny wouldn't know how to switch on the safety of a 9mm Beretta. An ordinary nanny wouldn't stay that calm after being caught red-handed in front of her employer. She wasn't just taking money. She knew exactly what she was doing. That was the conclusion taking shape in his mind. And it was completely wrong. But a wrong conclusion in the mind of a mafia boss wasn't like a wrong conclusion in the mind of an ordinary man. It didn't lead to misunderstanding. It led to consequences. The study door opened. Flynn Beckett walked in, tall, broad-shouldered, salt and pepper hair. The blank face of a man who'd grown used to seeing everything without reacting to any of it. He took in the room in a single sweep, the open safe, the cash scattered across the floor, the gun in Easton's hand, the nanny standing motionless in the middle of it all, and understood the situation at once without needing a single explanation. Take Zoe and Maddie back to their room, Easton said, his eyes never leaving Catalina. Close the door. Flynn walked over to the girls. Zoe looked at her father, then at Catalina, then back at her father again. She was 4 years old, but those blue eyes were already old enough to understand that something wasn't right. Daddy, Cat was teaching us. Zoe. Just one word, but Easton's voice carried something even a 4-year-old child could understand, that she wasn't to say another thing. Flynn lifted Maddie into his arms. The little girl didn't resist. She only looked at Catalina over Flynn's shoulder with wide, silent eyes, her lips pressed together as though she were trying to memorize Catalina's face as carefully as she could, as if she somehow knew this might be the last time. Zoe took Flynn's hand, but turned back once they reached the door. Cat? Her voice was tiny. Catalina forced a smile. It's okay, sweetheart. But that was a lie, and both she and that 4-year-old child knew it. The door closed behind Flynn and the girls. Now there were only 2 people left in the room, Easton Greyfield and Catalina Herrera, a mafia boss and a nanny. And between them lay the gun, the stacks of money, the open safe, and a false conclusion waiting to destroy everything. Easton set the gun down on the desk, slowly. Then he looked straight into Catalina's eyes and spoke in the kind of voice anyone in Chicago's underworld would have understood as a final warning. You've seen things you were never supposed to see. Catalina didn't step back. She didn't tremble, and that quiet dignity that refused to bend, became the very thing that made Easton angrier than anything else. Because in his world, there were only 2 kinds of people who weren't afraid, the dangerous and the foolish. And he still hadn't decided which one she was. Easton didn't say another word after that warning. He turned away, stepped into the hallway, pulled out his phone, and made one call. Ashford. Get to the 47th floor. Now. Then he stood there with his back against the wall across from the study door, his arms folded over his chest, and waited. He didn't look at Catalina. He didn't need to, because to Easton Greyfield, once a decision had been made, the person standing in front of him no longer existed. Neil Ashford appeared in less than 3 minutes. The penthouse's head butler, 33 years old, wearing a gray suit without a single crease. His hair slicked neatly back, his face carrying the kind of courtesy that had been calculated down to the last millimeter. He stopped in front of Easton and gave a slight bow of his head. Sir, Miss Herrera is out of here within 10 minutes, Easton said, his voice flat. Check everything she has. Phone, handbag, everything. If there are any images, copies, or any data at all connected to what's in my study, I want to know immediately. Her final month's pay? Neil asked, and something flickered in his eyes when he said it, so quickly that an ordinary person would have missed it. But it was there, a tiny flash, like a gambler who'd just turned over a good card. Hold it, Easton replied. until the search is done. Neil nodded, turned, and walked into the study where Catalina was still standing. She hadn't moved since the girls had been taken out. Her arms hung at her sides, her back was straight, and her eyes were fixed ahead. She wasn't bowing her head. She wasn't begging, and that seemed to irritate Neil, because he was used to people being afraid of him in this house. "Come with me," he said, and led her to the small room at the end of the hallway, the room Catalina had lived in for the past 2 years. It was just large enough for a single bed, a narrow wardrobe, and a small table by the window where she usually sat writing in her notebook every night. Neil opened the door and looked around. He didn't need long to search, because there was almost nothing to search. A faded canvas backpack hung from the hook behind the door. Inside it were 2 neatly folded changes of clothes, a small pouch of toiletries, a paperback book with worn corners, and an empty wallet. That was everything Catalina Herrera owned, everything she had in this world after 27 years of living. But Neil's clinical search had missed one thing: a single $100 bill tucked deeply into the interior lining of her backpack, an emergency stash she had kept untouched for years, a silent guarantee that she would never be completely stranded if the world turned its back on her again. Someone who'd grown up in the foster care system learned one lesson very early, a lesson most people never had to learn: never own more than what fits into a single bag, because you never know when you'll have to leave. Neil went through each item, slowly, more thoroughly than necessary. He checked every compartment of the backpack, turned every page of the book as if he expected to find something hidden inside, then stopped at the phone. It was an old smartphone. The screen cracked at one corner. Neil switched it on and scrolled through the photo library. Every single image was of Zoe and Maddie, the girls shaping clay, the girls asleep at nap time, curled into each other, Maddie buttoning her shirt by herself for the first time, her face solemn as if she were solving some impossible problem, Zoe grinning with ice cream smeared across her nose. Hundreds of photos. Not one of them had anything to do with the study, the safe, or anything that belonged to Easton Greyfield. But Neil didn't stop. He kept scrolling, very slowly, his thumb brushing past each picture with a degree of care no one would have needed if the goal had only been to inspect. His eyes swept over every detail in every image: the angle, the room in the background, the door frame, the hallway. He was memorizing. He wasn't looking for evidence for Easton. He was gathering information for himself. Then he pressed delete. "Security procedure," he said, his voice gentle and polite. But the corner of his mouth lifted ever so slightly as he watched the screen go blank. Catalina watched the pictures disappear, 2 years of memories erased in 30 seconds. She didn't protest. Not because she agreed, but because she understood that protesting wouldn't change a thing. When you grow up with nothing, you learn how to lose without collapsing. You just stand there, breathe, and keep moving. "Done," Neil said, placing the empty phone back into her hand. Then he added, his voice lowered just enough for only the 2 of them to hear, "I always knew outsiders couldn't be trusted in this house." Catalina looked at him. She said nothing, but her eyes stayed on Neil's face for longer than a second. And in that moment, she saw what Easton's anger had hidden, that this butler wasn't surprised by any of what was happening. He'd been waiting for it, perhaps even hoping for it. Catalina slung the faded backpack over her shoulder. It was almost weightless. Then she stepped out of the room. The hallway was long, covered in thick carpet, with soft golden light falling from the recessed lamps in the walls. And at the far end of it, Easton Greyfield was standing there, arms folded, back against the wall, his face expressionless, as if he were waiting for an elevator instead of watching an innocent woman walk away with everything she owned in this life fitting inside one worn backpack. Catalina passed by him. She didn't stop. She didn't look. But Easton looked, and something, very small, very quick, moved through those gray eyes when he saw the backpack on her shoulder. Just one backpack, for an entire life, but he pushed it away at once, because Easton Greyfield had spent his whole life pushing away anything that made him uncomfortable. And the feeling that had just brushed across his chest, vague, unsettling, resting somewhere between suspicion and guilt, was something he didn't have time for. Not yet. But it would come back. And when it did, it wouldn't be vague anymore. Catalina knew she wasn't allowed to stop. The order had been clear. 10 minutes. Out of here. Don't look back. But her legs wouldn't listen. As she passed the girl's bedroom door, she heard Zoe saying something to Flynn, her little voice trembling, and her body stopped before her mind could give the command. She knew Easton was still standing at the end of the hall. She knew Neil was watching from somewhere. She knew that stepping into this room now meant breaking every rule. The Mafia boss of the penthouse on the 47th floor had just laid down. But Catalina Herrera had spent her whole life living by other people's rules. And this time, this one time, she chose to listen to something else. She pushed the door open. Flynn was standing by the window with his back turned, saying something into the phone. When he saw Catalina, he stopped, looked at her, then glanced out into the hallway as if weighing whether he should block her. But then he did nothing at all. He simply turned away. Perhaps that was Flynn Beckett's only version of compassion, the only kind he allowed himself to show in this house. Zoe was sitting on the bed, her tiny legs dangling, her eyes red with tears. Maddie sat beside her, holding the worn brown teddy bear Catalina had given her for her 3rd birthday. When Zoe saw Catalina step inside, she slid off the bed and ran to her at once. 2 little arms wrapped around Catalina's legs and held tight, as if she clung hard enough, the grown-ups wouldn't be able to make anyone leave. "When is Cat coming back?" Catalina knelt down to Zoe's eye level. She tried to keep her voice steady, but her throat was being squeezed shut from the inside. "Cat has to go away for a little while, sweetheart." How long is a little while? Catalina couldn't answer that, because the real answer, the answer she would never say to a 4-year-old child, was maybe forever. Maddie didn't run to hug her the way her sister had. She stayed on the bed, clutching the teddy bear, looking at Catalina with those strangely quiet blue eyes. This child spoke so little. From the day Catalina had started working here, Maddie had always been the child of silence, the child of hand squeezes instead of words, of nods instead of answers. But today she opened her mouth. "Cat." Her voice was as soft as a falling leaf. "I dream about you every night." Catalina bit down on her lower lip. She felt something crack inside her chest, not shatter completely, but crack, enough for the pain to spread through her whole body. She walked to the bed, sat beside Maddie, and gathered the little girl into her arms. Zoe climbed up after them and slipped into her other arm. The 3 of them sat there in silence, and Catalina knew this was the last time she would ever hold these 2 warm little bodies, so she held them tightly enough to remember, but gently enough not to frighten them. "Listen to Cat, okay?" she whispered, her voice warm but trembling at the edges. "No matter what happens, no matter who's beside you, or if no one's beside you, always remember one thing." Zoe lifted her head. Maddie stayed nestled against Catalina's chest. "Always do the right thing, even when no one's watching." Zoe nodded with the kind of solemn seriousness only a child could have, whole and absolute and untouched by doubt. "I promise." Catalina kissed each girl on the forehead, then she let them go, set them back on the bed, stood up, and in the very moment she turned away, her mind went to the thing she had left resting on the edge of the bed in her own room at the end of the hall, the notebook. Dark brown leather, worn along the spine from being opened and closed every night for 2 years. Over 700 handwritten pages, 1 page for each day. Each day, a small piece of the lives of the 2 children she loved, as if they were her own blood. Catalina walked over and laid her hand on the cover. Her fingers brushed lightly over the old leather. 1 second. 2 seconds. Then she drew her hand back. She left the notebook there. She didn't take it with her, because that notebook wasn't hers. It belonged to Zoe and Maddie. It belonged to this house. And Catalina Herrera never took what wasn't hers. She stepped into the hallway, each step longer than the one before, as if she were afraid that if she walked too slowly, she would turn back. The elevator was at the end of the hall, and midway there, with his back against the wall, Easton Greyfield was still standing there, his arms still folded, his face still carved from stone. Catalina stopped 3 steps away from him. She hadn't meant to say anything else. There was nothing to say to a man who'd never given her the chance to open her mouth. But then she thought of the loaded gun in the safe. She thought of Maddie's tiny hands holding that gun, and she spoke, not for herself, but for the 2 little girls sitting in that room behind her. "Keep them safe, Mr. Greyfield." Easton didn't answer. Catalina didn't wait for one. She stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the ground floor. The steel doors began to close, and through the narrowing slit, Catalina saw Easton one last time. He was still standing there, his arms still folded, but his jaw had tightened slightly more than it had a few seconds before. The elevator doors closed completely. Catalina disappeared. And Easton Greyfield didn't know that the thing she'd just left behind on the small bed in the room at the end of the hall, that notebook of over 700 handwritten pages, would be the thing that forced him to face the truth of who he really was. The penthouse on the 47th floor still had everything. The crystal chandelier was still glowing. The marble floors were still polished to a shine. The refrigerator was still full of food Chef Vera had prepared before leaving. But the house was missing something no object could ever buy. And the 2 4-year-old children felt that before the adults did. At dinner that evening, Zoe sat in front of the plate of mac and cheese she had always loved, but she didn't touch it. She used her fork to push the noodles back and forth across the plate, her eyes lowered, her lips pressed together. Easton sat at the head of the table, cutting into his steak, pretending everything was normal. "Eat, Zoe." "I'm not hungry. You haven't eaten anything since noon." "I'm not hungry." Her voice was flat, not angry, not sad, only refusing. The kind of refusal children use when they don't have enough words to explain what is happening inside them. Maddie, meanwhile, wouldn't sit at the table at all. She was in the bedroom, in the corner by the window, holding the worn brown teddy bear Catalina had given her. She wasn't crying. She wasn't calling for anyone. She wasn't saying a single word. She just sat there, her head resting against the wall, her eyes open but focused on nothing. And that silence, the silence of a 4-year-old child choosing not to make a sound at all, was far more frightening than crying, because crying is a call for help. Silence is what happens when a child has stopped believing anyone will come. Easton called the nanny agency that same night. Triple the fee for emergency after-hours service. He didn't care. The first person to arrive was a middle-aged woman named Margaret, 15 years of experience, a flawless record. She walked into the girl's room with a professional smile, bent down to Zoe's eye level, and said, "Hello, sweetheart. My name is Margaret. I'll play with you, all right?" Zoe looked at her. "You're not Kat." "No, I'm Margaret. When is Kat coming back?" Margaret looked over at Easton standing in the doorway. He gave the slightest shake of his head. Margaret turned back and tried to redirect. "Why don't we play with puzzles?" "When is Kat coming back? Or maybe we can read a book." "When is Kat coming back?" The same question, over and over again. Not angry, not shouted, just a simple question no one could answer the right way. Margaret lasted 1 hour and 45 minutes. The second person, a young woman named Rachel, lasted less than an hour. It wasn't because Zoe was difficult. It wasn't because Maddie was hard to handle. It was because both girls treated them with a kind of politeness so cold it stung. The kind of politeness children learn when they grow up in a house where the staff changes all the time. The kind of politeness that says, "You're not the person I need." 10 o'clock. The penthouse was back to holding only 3 people. Easton sat in his study with the door closed. He opened the safe and checked again. The money was all there. The passports were still in place. The Beretta lay neatly on its rack. Everything was intact. Nothing was missing. He closed the safe, leaned back in his chair, and shut his eyes. "I did the right thing," he told himself softly in the empty room. And if it had been the right thing, why did he have to repeat that sentence 3 times in his own mind before it began to sound true? Easton turned off the light in the study, walked through the dark hallway, stopped by the girl's room and opened the door quietly. Zoe was already asleep, curled up in bed with her face buried in the pillow. Maddie lay beside her sister, but her hand was still clutching the teddy bear. Even in sleep, she wouldn't let it go, as if she loosened her grip, the last thing still connecting her to Catalina would disappear too. Easton stood in the doorway looking at his daughters. In the dark, the room felt strangely hollow, without the quiet, comforting presence that had filled it for the last 2 years. He looked at the empty space by the window where she used to sit, realizing the silence he had created was now deafening. The room looked as though she had only stepped out for a moment and would soon come back. But she wouldn't come back. He had made certain of that. He closed the bedroom door, went to his own room, lay down. The ceiling stretched high above him in the darkness. His eyes stayed open. Sleep didn't come. The clock in the kitchen struck 2 in the morning when Easton heard the sound. Small, far away, but in the absolute stillness of the penthouse in the middle of the night, it was as clear as a bell, crying. Not the cry of a child asking for something. It was the kind of crying that escapes from a dream, the kind a child can't control because it comes from somewhere deeper than consciousness. Easton sat up at once. Barefoot on the cold floor, he moved quickly down the hall to the girls' room, pushed the door open. Zoe was still asleep, not moving, but Maddie was crying. She lay curled into herself, her eyes shut tight, tears running down her temples into the pillow, her hand squeezing the teddy bear so hard her knuckles had gone white. Her mouth trembled, and between broken sobs, scattered words slipped from her lips. "Cat. I didn't take it. Cat said not to take it." Easton froze in the doorway. Cat said, "It's not ours. Don't take it." She was dreaming about yesterday afternoon, dreaming about the moment Catalina had knelt beside the safe and taught her what was right and what was wrong. And in the dream of a 4-year-old child, that lesson was clearer than any evidence Easton Greyfield thought he had seen. He walked to the bed, sat down on the edge, placed his hand on Maddie's back and rubbed gently, trying to soothe her through the nightmare. But his hand was trembling slightly, not from the cold, but because for the first time since that afternoon, something in the wall he had built inside himself had begun to crack. It hadn't shattered yet, only cracked, but sometimes, one small fracture is enough to make an entire wall begin to shake. The next morning, sunlight poured into the kitchen through the great glass wall overlooking Lake Michigan, but the penthouse still felt cold. Easton sat at the dining table with a cup of coffee in front of him, untouched. He'd barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard Maddie's voice again in her delirious sleep. Cat said, "Don't take it." And every time he heard it, the crack inside his chest widened a little more. The girl sat across from him. Zoe stirred her bowl of cereal without purpose, her eyes lowered. Maddie sat still, the teddy bear resting in her lap, both hands wrapped tightly around it as if she were afraid someone might snatch it away. No one said anything. Breakfast in the penthouse of one of the most powerful men in Chicago was so silent that he could hear the milk dripping from Zoe's spoon back into the bowl. Then Maddie spoke. No one expected it, because Maddie never talked much, especially not in the morning, especially not when Catalina wasn't here to gently ask her, "What does Maddie want to tell Cat today?" But this morning she opened her mouth, and once she began, she didn't stop. "Daddy." Easton looked up. "I'm sorry." Those 2 words made Easton set his coffee cup down. "What are you sorry for, Maddie?" She looked down at the teddy bear. Her tiny fingers rubbed at one of its ears. "A few days ago I saw you press numbers on the metal box in your room." Easton felt something cold run down his spine. "I remembered the numbers. I thought it was a button game, like the vending machine at the mall you take us to." She paused, took a breath, then continued. "Yesterday I went into your room. I pressed those numbers. The box opened." Easton didn't move, not because he was calm, but because his body had gone rigid, the way it does when you begin to see the first piece of a picture you know is going to destroy everything you believed. Inside there were lots of colored papers. Maddie went on, her voice completely calm in the way only a 4-year-old child could sound calm. "And the heavy toy. I picked it up because it looked like Zoe's water gun, but heavier." Easton felt the air leave his lungs. Zoe put her spoon down, looked at her father, then finished the story for her sister. "Cat came into your room because she heard us laughing. Cat saw Maddie holding that thing." She pointed with her hand as if describing the gun again. Cat ran over and took it out of Maddie's hands, really fast. Then Cat did something to it, pressed something on the side. The safety. Catalina had switched on the safety, instinctively recalling the brief moment she had once seen Easton check the weapon in his study. The protective instinct inside her moved before her mind had time to think. Zoe kept going, her voice quicker now, as if she'd been holding these words inside since yesterday, and now they were finally pouring out. Cat said it wasn't a toy. She said it was dangerous. She said we must never touch it. Then Cat sat down and taught us. Cat said, "We never take what isn't ours." Cat was putting everything back into the metal box when you came home. Silence. The kind of silence so heavy it had physical weight, pressing down on shoulders, on lungs, on everything Easton Greyfield had thought he understood. And then the whole scene from yesterday afternoon played again inside his head, but this time every image had been turned completely inside out. Catalina kneeling in front of the safe, not because she was stealing, but because she was putting back the things his daughters had taken out, the money on the floor. Not because she'd scattered it there, but because 2 4-year-old children had thought it was colored paper, the gun with the safety on. Not because she knew how to handle weapons, but because she'd just snatched it out of Maddie's hands in time, before something irreversible happened. And what had he done? He'd accused her. He'd humiliated her. He'd threatened her. He'd thrown her out of his house into the Chicago night, without money, without a phone, without anywhere to go. She was the only person who had saved his daughter from a loaded gun, and he'd treated her like a criminal. But the truth didn't stop there, because when the first shock settled, a second truth crashed over him, deeper, more painful, and impossible to blame on anyone else. He was the one who'd left the safe code where his 4-year-old daughter could see it. He was the one who'd left a loaded gun inside that safe without a second lock. He was the one, the Mafia boss who guarded everything with teeth and claws, who had left deadly danger within reach of his own children. Catalina wasn't the danger in this house. He was. Easton stood up, abruptly. The chair flew backward, its legs scraping across the stone floor with a sharp, grating scream. The girls flinched and looked at their father. His face had gone pale, both hands braced against the table, his head lowered, his shoulders locked tight. He looked like a man who'd just been punched square in the chest without time to defend himself. "Daddy?" Zoe asked softly. Easton didn't answer. She waited a moment, then said, her voice gentle but clear, with the simple truth only children can speak without hesitation. "Daddy, can you say sorry?" Easton lifted his head and looked at his daughter. Kat said grown-ups are allowed to say sorry too. And that sentence from the mouth of a 4-year-old child sitting in front of an untouched bowl of cereal, hit Easton Greyfield harder than any blow he'd ever taken in his life, because it was true. It was so true he couldn't fight it, couldn't justify himself against it, couldn't push it aside. And for the first time in his life, the most powerful Mafia boss in Chicago, the man who'd never apologized to anyone, finally understood that those 2 words weren't a sign of weakness. They were the only thing that could save him now. Easton left the breakfast table without saying another word to the girls. He walked down the hallway, passing the study where the safe remained silent, and hesitated at the spot where he had coldly watched her leave, before finally stopping in front of the last door at the end of the hall, Catalina's room. He had never gone into this room. In the 2 years she had worked here, he had never once stepped across that threshold, because it had never been on the list of things he needed to control. It was only the nanny's room, a place where an employee slept. Nothing more. He pushed the door open, and the first thing that struck him wasn't the belongings. It was the emptiness. The room was smaller than he had imagined. Much smaller. The bathroom in his suite was larger than this place. A narrow single bed against the wall, the white sheets folded smooth, without a single wrinkle. A small wardrobe, the door left slightly open, empty inside except for a few plastic hangers swaying faintly. A wooden table by the window, with nothing on its surface except a pale ring where a glass of water had rested every night. No family photographs on the wall because she had no family. No personal decorations because she had nothing to decorate with. The room looked like a hotel room after the guest had checked out, clean, orderly, and completely without a soul. 2 years living here, and Catalina Herrera had left behind fewer traces than an overnight guest. Easton stood in the middle of the room, and for the first time he felt in full the thing he had never seen while she was still here, that this woman had lived in his house, cared for his children, loved his children, and yet had taken possession of nothing. She had existed here while leaving almost no proof that she had ever existed at all. Then he saw it, on the edge of the bed, the dark brown leather notebook. Easton walked over and picked it up. It was heavier than he expected. He opened the first page. Small handwriting, careful, slightly slanted to the right. Blue-black ink. The date written in the upper right corner. It was the day Catalina had started working here, 2 years ago. First day. Zoe called me Kat, because she still couldn't say Catalina. Maddie didn't say anything. She only watched me through dinner. Then before bed, she held my little finger, didn't speak, just held on. I think that was her way of saying, "All right, you can stay." Easton turned the next page, then the next, then another. Every page was a day. Every day was a small world he had completely missed. The new word Zoe learned today, magnificent. She heard it in a cartoon and used it for everything. "This spoon is magnificent, Kat." A scribbled crayon drawing taped right onto the page. 4 stick figures standing side by side. And underneath Zoe had scrawled, "Family," even though the letters were crooked and one of them was backward. The time Maddie was afraid of thunder in March. She wouldn't stop shaking. I held her in my arms and sang the lullaby my mother used to sing. She gripped my shirt all night. The next morning she said, "Cat, sing again." That was the longest sentence she had ever spoken. The time Zoe asked one evening when Easton didn't come home for dinner, the question every rich child asks at least once. Why is Daddy never home? And beneath that question, Catalina had written, "I told her Daddy loves you so much. Daddy works because of you." She asked, "So does Daddy love work more than us?" I didn't know the answer, but I said, "No, Daddy loves you most. He just doesn't know how to show it yet." I hope I didn't lie to her. Easton had to stop on that page. He sat down on the edge of Catalina's little bed, that narrow bed with the white sheets he had never once noticed existed, and looked at those words until they blurred. Not because he was crying. Easton Greyfield didn't cry, but something was happening behind his eyes, hot and painful. Something he had no name for, because he had never allowed himself to feel it long enough to give it one. She had protected his image in front of his children, even when he wasn't home, even when he didn't deserve it, even when no one was watching. He turned to the last page. The words had been written the very night before, just hours before everything fell apart. Today, Maddie buttoned her shirt by herself. For the first time, she kept trying, and her face was so serious. Then when she finally did it, she looked up and smiled. The smile looked exactly like her mother's in the photograph on Mr. Greyfield's desk. So exactly that I had to turn my face away for a second. I wish he had been home to see that moment. There are things money can't buy, and one of them is the first time your child buttons her own shirt. Easton closed the notebook. Both hands rested on the dark brown leather cover, and he saw that they were trembling. The hands that had signed thousands of contracts. The hands that had held the power of an empire. The hands that had picked up the gun from the floor yesterday and accused an innocent woman were now shaking over the blue-black ink of an orphaned nanny he had thrown out into the night. Over 700 pages. 2 years. 1 page for every day. Not a single day missed. And in those 700 pages, not one line had been written for herself. All of it had been written for Zoe and Maddie. All of it for the 2 children she had loved, with the kind of love that he, their father, had been too busy to give them. Easton pulled out his phone, dialed a number. When he spoke, his voice held only 3 words, but those 3 words carried the weight of everything that had just collapsed inside him. "Flynn, find her." Silence on the other end of the line. Then Flynn asked, his voice careful, "Find her for what, sir?" Easton looked at the notebook in his lap, looked at the empty room where she had lived for 2 years without leaving behind anything except over 700 pages of love written for his children. "Find her, right now. Now let us go back to the night before." Back to the moment the elevator doors closed, and Catalina Herrera walked out of Greyfield Tower alone. The wind off Lake Michigan blew along the avenue, cold, damp, carrying the smell of water and the smell of the city at night. Catalina pulled the zipper of her thin coat all the way up to her throat, but the wind still slipped through every seam. The faded backpack on her shoulder was so light she could barely feel it, and perhaps that was the most painful part of all, that after nearly 30 years of being alive, everything she owned was still lighter than a 4-year-old child. She walked along Michigan Avenue, past glass towers glowing with light, past restaurants where people were laughing over glasses of wine, past boutiques already closed, though their display windows still glittered with luxury brands. The city was beautiful at night, but its beauty belonged to other people, and as she walked, an old memory came to her without invitation. Not a memory of the penthouse, or the safe, or those cold gray eyes. A much older memory, so old she had thought she had buried it deeply enough. 18 years old, the last day in the foster care system. She stood at the door of the 7th family, the last family, with a black trash bag holding everything she owned. Not a suitcase, not a backpack, a black trash bag, the large kind, the kind people use to throw away things they no longer need. Mrs. Henderson stood on the front steps with her arms folded over her chest, her voice not cold but not warm either, the voice of someone saying something they had already practiced in their head many times before. "You're 18 now, Catalina. We don't need you anymore. Not, we can't keep you. Not, the system requires it. But don't need." Those 2 words had followed her for 9 years, followed her through 4 years of college on 1 meal of instant noodles a day, followed her through dozens of interviews where people looked at a file with no section marked next of kin and shook their heads, followed her all the way to the door of the penthouse, on the 47th floor, where she had thought she had finally found somewhere she belonged. And now they were following her out here, onto the streets of Chicago at 11 at night, reminding her that the pattern of her life had never changed. Arrive, love, get sent away, repeat. Catalina reached a bus stop on Michigan Avenue near Millennium Park. The stop was empty. A metal bench under a cloudy plastic shelter. The electronic sign said the next bus would arrive in 45 minutes. She sat down, set the backpack on her lap, looked straight ahead. She didn't cry. Catalina Herrera had learned not to cry from a time when she had been even younger than Zoe and Maddie. In foster care, tears did not bring mercy. They only brought attention, and attention was not always a good thing. So she sat there in silence, looking at her hands resting on the backpack. The same hands that only hours earlier had buttoned Maddie's shirt. The same hands that had snatched a loaded gun out of the tiny fingers of a 4-year-old child. The same hands that had switched on the safety in less than 2 seconds, because the instinct to protect was stronger than everything else. "I did the right thing," she whispered, her voice dissolving into the wind off Lake Michigan. "That is enough. But enough is a strange word when you are sitting alone on a bus stop bench close to midnight without knowing where you will sleep that night." The next morning, on the 47th floor, Easton Greyfield was driving away from the building before the notebook had even lost the imprint of his fingers. Flynn sat in the passenger seat, phone pressed to his ear, making one call after another. "She doesn't have a home of her own," Flynn said after the 3rd call. "Her official residential address in the personnel file is your penthouse. There is no secondary address, no relatives, no emergency contact." Easton tightened his grip on the wheel. Every piece of information Flynn gave him was another blade, because every detail reminded him that the woman he had thrown out onto the street the night before truly had nowhere to go. Not the kind of nowhere that means nowhere convenient, but nowhere in this world at all. Her phone number? Neil wiped the data from her phone before returning it. By now, the battery has also run out because she spent the entire night outside without a charger. Easton ground his teeth together. He remembered ordering Neil to check the phone. He remembered not asking a single question, not listening to a single explanation. "Any lead at all?" Flynn shook his head. Easton pressed the button to lower the partition and called through the car's Bluetooth to Vera, the chef. No answer. He called up to the girls' room. The temporary nanny picked up. "Put Zoe on," rustling. Then Zoe's voice came through, still sad. "Daddy? Zoe, do you know where Kat used to go besides our home?" Silence for a moment. Then she answered, her voice small but certain. "Kat used to tell us about the bus stop behind the park. Kat said she used to sit there and watch people go by before she came to live with us. The bus stop behind the park. Millennium Park. Michigan Avenue." Easton pressed down on the accelerator. The black Bentley tore through the streets of Chicago in the morning, past Grant Park, then onto Michigan Avenue. And he saw her, sitting on the metal bench beneath the cloudy plastic shelter of the bus stop, the faded backpack on her lap, her back straight, her eyes looking ahead. She looked smaller than she had inside the penthouse. Much smaller, as though the glass walls and high ceilings of the 47th floor had given her a size that was never truly hers. And now, sitting here on a bus stop bench, she had returned to the exact size the world had always assigned to her. Small, unimportant, easy to forget. Easton stopped the car beside the bus stop, turned off the engine. His hands rested on the steering wheel, and for the first time in his life, the most powerful Mafia boss in Chicago didn't know how to open the car door, because every door he had ever opened had led to things he could control, and this door led to something he could not control. The truth. Easton opened the car door and stepped out. Catalina didn't turn around. She had seen the black Bentley the moment it pulled up, had recognized the familiar hum of the engine she heard every morning when he left for work. But she didn't move. She stayed seated on the bench. She kept looking straight ahead, because Catalina Herrera had spent her whole life waiting for people to come back, and she had broken herself of that habit a long time ago. Easton walked to the side of the bench, stopped 2 steps away from her. Chicago was loud around them that morning. Traffic, pedestrians, the distant cry of an elevated train. But between the two of them there was a private silence, dense and heavy. He looked at her. She still didn't look at him. "I was wrong." 3 words. Easton said them in a low voice. Not the voice of command, not the voice of the man who controlled half of Chicago's underworld. It was the voice of a man standing in front of something that power and money couldn't fix. Catalina finally turned her head. She looked at him. There was no anger in her brown eyes, no bitterness, only the exhaustion of someone who had been treated unfairly so many times that it no longer surprised her. I know. 2 words. Gentle, not sharp. And it was that gentleness that hurt. Because if she had shouted in his face, if she had cursed him, if she had cried, Easton would have known how to deal with that. He had handled worse confrontations all his life, but the calmness of someone who had grown too used to injustice, he had no tools for that. The girls told me, he said. Maddie, Zoe, both of them told me. The safe, the code, the gun, everything. Catalina didn't answer. He went on, and each word he spoke seemed heavier than the one before. Zoe told me you snatched the gun out of Maddie's hand, that you switched on the safety, that you were teaching the girls not to touch what didn't belong to them, that you were putting everything back when I walked in. Silence. A bus rolled past in the distance, and I didn't let you say a single word. Catalina looked at him for a few seconds longer, then she spoke, her voice steady, not raised, simply clear, as though she had been shaping this sentence through the whole long night on that cold bench. You decided who I was before you gave me a chance to show you who I was. Easton didn't answer right away, because the sentence was too true to argue with. You saw a nanny kneeling beside an open safe, she continued, her voice still calm. But now something deeper moved beneath it, something she had kept hidden for a very long time. You didn't see the woman who was protecting your daughters. She stopped, drew in a breath, then continued. My whole life, people have looked at me and seen the orphan, seen the foster care girl, seen the maid, seen the nanny. No one ever looks and sees the person I really am. She lowered her gaze to her hands resting on the backpack. I thought it would be different in your home. Easton felt the ground shift under his feet. Not literally, but in the sense that everything he believed about himself, that he was fair, that he was clear-sighted, that he always read situations correctly, was collapsing beneath him. I want you to come back. He said it faster than usual, as if he were afraid that if he spoke too slowly, she would disappear before he could finish. Catalina looked at him. For a long time, then she said, slowly, clearly, one word at a time, You want the nanny to come back, not me. That struck Easton like a slap he couldn't block, because he knew she was right. On the drive over here, he had thought, I have to bring her back, because the girls need a nanny. And the way he had framed it in his own mind, nanny instead of Catalina, proved that she was completely right. He opened his mouth to say something, but the sharp hiss of brakes cut across the moment. A bus was pulling into the stop, the last morning run before the schedule thinned out. Yellow lights flashing. Catalina looked at the bus, then at Easton. The bus stopped. The doors opened. The driver waited. And Easton Greyfield, a man who had never waited for anyone in his life, stood still on the sidewalk of Michigan Avenue, waiting, not ordering, not demanding, not controlling, just standing there and waiting. Catalina looked at the open bus door. It was an escape. She could step onto it, go somewhere else, start over again the way she had done all her life. But then she thought of Maddie, the quiet little girl clutching her teddy bear in the corner of the room. She thought of Zoe. When is Cat coming back? And she knew that whether Easton Greyfield deserved it or not, those 2 little girls had done nothing wrong. If I come back, she said, her voice firm, her eyes meeting his directly. I'm coming back for Zoe and Maddie, not for you. Easton nodded at once. I understand. The bus doors closed. The bus pulled away from the stop. Catalina didn't get on. She rose from the bench, slipped the backpack over her shoulder, and started walking toward the black Bentley parked at the curb, not with the step of someone who had been rescued, but with the step of someone who had chosen for herself. And perhaps that was what Easton needed to understand more than anything else, that Catalina Herrera wasn't coming back because he had allowed it. She was coming back because she had decided to. The Bentley moved along Michigan Avenue in silence. Flynn sat in the front passenger seat beside the driver, his eyes fixed ahead, not turning around, not asking a single question. He understood that there were moments when the best kind of presence was invisibility. In the back seat, Easton sat on the right, Catalina on the left, and between them was the empty space of a seat no one tried to fill. Catalina looked out through the window. The city slid past outside, glass buildings reflecting the morning sun, the trees lining the avenue just beginning to show new leaves. She didn't say anything. Not because she was angry, but because she still didn't know what she was feeling. Everything had happened too quickly. Being thrown out, the night on the bench, then him appearing, then those 3 words, "I was wrong," and now she was sitting in a $1 million car, on her way back to the place that had cast her out only 12 hours earlier. What she felt inside was like water in a glass that had been stirred too hard, cloudy, unsettled, impossible to tell where relief ended and caution began, and fear was woven through both. Easton stared straight ahead, but from the corner of his eye he caught one small detail. Catalina's hand resting on her lap was trembling slightly, not much, just a faint shiver in her fingertips, the kind of trembling that comes when someone has sat outside in the cold wind all night, and the body still hasn't fully warmed again. He didn't say anything. He only reached toward the control panel by the door and switched on the heated seat on her side. A soft click. Then warmth began to spread through the leather beneath her. Catalina felt it immediately. She glanced at Easton. He didn't look at her. His eyes remained forward, his jaw still lightly set, his hand resting on his thigh, as if he hadn't just done anything at all. Catalina didn't say thank you. Easton didn't wait for her to, and in that tiny moment, in that gesture, neither of them acknowledged. Something shifted between them. Not something large, not something clear. Just this. For the first time since Catalina had entered his house, Easton Greyfield did something for her, not out of control, not out of command, not even out of correction, but simply because she was cold. The car turned into the parking garage of Greyfield Tower. The private elevator carried them up to the 47th floor. The doors opened, and the first sound that hit them wasn't music, wasn't the television, but the sound of tiny feet running across marble floors. Maddie appeared at the end of the hallway. Her blonde curls were tousled, her blue eyes wide, the teddy bear dangling from her right hand. She saw Catalina, and what happened next made everyone in the penthouse go still. Maddie screamed. Not a little cry, not the soft call she usually used, but a real scream, loud, breaking out from deep in her little chest, echoing through the hallway, bouncing off the glass walls. Cat. For the first time in 4 years of life, Maddie Greyfield screamed out loud. She dropped the teddy bear, ran. Her little feet slapped across the floor. Catalina dropped to her knees just as Maddie threw herself into her arms. The child's small arms wrapped around her neck and held so tightly, Catalina had to lean back to keep her balance. Then Zoe appeared, running from the kitchen, crumbs still clinging to her face, shouting, "Cat! Cat! Cat!" and threw herself around Catalina from behind. Catalina held both girls, one arm around Maddie, one around Zoe, and then the thing she hadn't allowed herself to do through the whole night, not on the street, not on the bench, not in front of Easton, finally happened. She cried. Not the kind of crying that comes from pain, not the kind that comes from injustice, but the crying of someone who had gone through life with no one waiting for her, and for the first time stepped through a door and found someone running toward her. Tears fell into Maddie's hair, onto Zoe's shoulder, and Catalina didn't try to hide them, because these were the kind of tears that didn't need to be hidden. Zoe looked up, her face serious, then glanced over Catalina's shoulder toward her father standing by the elevator. "Did Daddy say sorry yet?" Easton looked at his daughter. "Yes." Zoe nodded, satisfied, as though the most complicated problem in the world had just been solved by 2 simple words. Then everything's okay. To children, things really were that simple. If you do wrong, you say sorry. If you say sorry, you are forgiven. If you are forgiven, you hold each other again. But Easton watched Catalina holding his daughters and knew he hadn't earned that kind of simplicity. Not yet. That evening, Catalina bathed the girls, dressed them in their pajamas, and tucked them into bed. Everything returned to the order the 3 of them had followed for 2 years. Brushing teeth, a bedtime story, then the song. Catalina sat between the 2 small beds. Maddie lay on the left, one hand holding the teddy bear, her eyes already drifting shut. Zoe lay on the right, chin propped on her pillow, trying to stay awake long enough to hear the whole song. Catalina began to sing. Spanish. The melody was slow, soft, low, and warm. The lullaby her mother had once sung to her before she died, when Catalina had been too young to understand the words but old enough to remember the tune. She had sung that song to Zoe and Maddie every night for 2 years. And tonight, after everything that had happened, the melody was still the same. Still slow, still soft, still warm, as if nothing in the world could shake the love resting inside those notes. Outside the bedroom door, Easton Greyfield stood with his back against the hallway wall. He didn't step inside. He only stood there, closed his eyes, and listened. The Spanish melody drifted through the crack of the half-open door, slipped into the dark hallway, and touched him in a place money and power had never reached. And for the first time in many years, the penthouse on the 47th floor no longer felt cold. The next morning, for the first time in the 2 years the girls had lived with Catalina, Easton Greyfield didn't go to work. There was no call to Flynn at 6, no black Bentley waiting in the garage at 6:30, no schedule of meetings, no contracts, no appointments, no one in the house was ever allowed to ask about. He sat at the breakfast table, a cup of coffee in front of him, and he watched. Catalina stood in the kitchen, moving with a rhythm he had never noticed before. Gentle, precise, every motion carrying a purpose. She took 2 plates from the cabinet, set them on the counter, and began preparing breakfast for the girls. Zoe's plate held a slice of toast cut into triangles, because she liked triangles, with banana slices arranged in a straight line beside it, because Zoe liked everything to be in a straight line. Maddie's plate was different. Her toast had been cut into the shape of a star. Easton watched Catalina use the knife carefully on each corner, trimming away the crust, keeping only the soft center. He had never known Maddie was afraid of bread crusts, 4 years of being her father, and he hadn't known his daughter wouldn't eat the crust. The girls came running to the table. Zoe climbed into her chair at once, looked at the toast, and cried out, "Maddie's star is so cute!" Maddie sat beside her sister, looked at her plate, then started eating without anyone needing to remind her. Catalina placed a glass of milk in front of Zoe, but instead of pouring it for her, she set the little pitcher beside the glass. Zoe looked at the pitcher, looked at Catalina, then picked it up herself and tipped it, pouring the milk into the glass. It spilled. Of course it spilled. A small white puddle spread across the tabletop, running toward the toast. Easton almost reached out to stop her, but Catalina was quicker, not to stop Zoe, but to lift the cloth she already had ready in her hand, gently blot the spilled milk, and say in an ordinary voice, "That was better than yesterday, Zoe." The little girl grinned, proud, because Catalina hadn't poured the milk for Zoe, not because she was lazy, but because she was teaching her to be independent. She knew the milk would spill. She had already been holding the cloth. She let the child try, let the milk spill, let the child learn, then cleaned it up without making her feel ashamed. And Easton watched all of it, the little pitcher, the star-shaped toast, the spilled milk, the cloth already waiting in her hand, and he understood something he had never seen in the last 2 years. This woman wasn't only feeding his daughters, she was raising them. Every meal, every tiny detail, was a lesson she had thought through, prepared for, and carried out in silence without anyone asking, and without anyone thanking her. Invisible people are often the ones holding everything together so it doesn't collapse. Easton set down his coffee cup. "I've been thinking about what happened," he said, his voice slow, weighing each word. Not because he was used to speaking slowly, but because for the first time he wanted to speak correctly instead of quickly. Catalina looked at him but didn't interrupt. The girls lifted their heads. "That day I thought I was protecting something important," he said. He looked down at his coffee, then looked back up. "It turns out I was protecting the least important thing in this entire house." Catalina didn't answer, but she understood he was speaking about the safe, about the money, about all the things he had placed above people and above dignity. Zoe set down her piece of toast, her face serious in the way only a 4-year-old can be serious. "Daddy, what's dignity?" Easton looked at his daughter. Where she had heard that word, he didn't know. Perhaps from his conversation with Catalina that the girls had accidentally overheard. Perhaps from Catalina herself, in one of the lessons he had never been there to witness. He thought for a moment before answering. "It's when you do the right thing, even when no one's watching." Zoe nodded slowly, her lips pressed together as she thought. Then Maddie lifted her head from the plate with the star-shaped toast. She looked at Catalina, and she said, her voice small, soft, but clear. "Like cat." 2 words. Silence fell over the breakfast table. Catalina lowered her face and pretended to wipe the kitchen counter, but her hand paused against the stone for 1 second too long. Zoe thought a few seconds more. Then she looked up, her blue eyes suddenly bright, and said with the certainty of a child who had just discovered a great truth, "Then Cat is richer than Daddy." Easton blinked. "Richer?" Zoe nodded, absolutely certain. Then she lifted her hand and placed her tiny palm over the left side of her chest. "Because Cat has more good things in here. Silence. The kind no one wanted to break because it was too true, too beautiful, too simple for any adult in the room to add anything without ruining it. Easton looked at Catalina. She was still standing by the counter, the dishcloth in her hand, her eyes lowered. But this time he didn't see the nanny. He didn't see the employee. He didn't see the foster care girl, or the orphaned child, or the woman he had accused 2 days earlier. He saw Catalina, only Catalina, and he understood that his 4-year-old daughter had been right. In this penthouse full of expensive things, the richest person wasn't him. 2 weeks passed, and the penthouse on the 47th floor began to change in ways no one spoke about. Yet everyone could feel. Easton started coming home earlier. Not every day, but often enough that Zoe stopped asking, "Is Daddy coming home for dinner?" and began saying instead, "Daddy, sit next to me." He started appearing at the breakfast table, a cup of coffee in his hand, his eyes following Catalina as she prepared things for the girls with the kind of attention he had once reserved only for contracts or financial reports. And there were small moments, very small, the kind where Catalina handed him his coffee each morning, her fingers brushing his when he took the cup, only for a fraction of a second, then both of them pulling their hands back, as though nothing had happened. The kind where Easton stood in the kitchen doorway watching her teach Zoe to write letters, and his gaze rested on her longer than necessary, longer than a man should look at his employee's nanny, before he turned away and reminded himself that he shouldn't be looking at her that way. No one said anything about those moments, but they existed, and they were gathering, but not everyone in the penthouse was pleased by the change. Neil Ashford had held the position of head butler for 3 years, from before Catalina ever arrived. He managed the staff, controlled the schedules, held the keys to every door in this building. He was the man Easton trusted with the jobs no one else was allowed to know about, arranging private meetings, moving sensitive documents, making sure the two sides of Easton Greyfield's life never overlapped. And now a nanny whose belongings he had searched, whose phone he had wiped clean, and whom he had thought he had removed forever, was sitting at the breakfast table with his employer, being looked at by that employer with an expression Neil had never seen Easton wear for anyone. She hadn't simply come back. She was becoming the most important person in this house, and that threatened everything Neil had built. One evening, after the penthouse had gone dark, Neil sat in his room on the lower floor with a phone pressed to his ear, calling a number he had kept for a long time but had never used. On the other end was Paxton Hale, 52 years old, silver-haired, rough-voiced, the boss who controlled the underground network on the south side of Chicago and Easton Greyfield's greatest rival for the past decade. "The nanny," Neil said, his voice low. She saw inside Greyfield's personal safe, fake passports, cash. She knows enough to destroy him. Silence on the other end. Then Paxton asked, his voice slow and measured, "Where is she now?" "In the house. Greyfield brought her back. Wherever she goes, he has a bodyguard follow her, but only one. In the afternoons, she usually takes the girls to Millennium Park." "One bodyguard," Paxton repeated. "Good," Neil ended the call. And if anyone had seen his face in that moment, they would have seen the exact same expression he had worn while searching Catalina's phone, the cold satisfaction of a man who had just placed a chess piece in exactly the right square. Tuesday afternoon the following week. Millennium Park was blazing with sunlight. Catalina sat on the grass near Cloud Gate, Zoe running in circles, chasing pigeons, Maddie sitting beside her, scribbling into the little notebook Catalina had just bought for her. The bodyguard stood about 15 meters away near the walkway, his eyes sweeping the area out of habit. An ordinary afternoon, until it wasn't. The black SUV pulled up hard along the curb on the far side of the park. 2 men stepped out, long coats, quick strides, heading straight toward the patch of grass where Catalina and the girls were sitting. Catalina noticed them before the bodyguard did, not because she knew who they were, but because when you grow up in foster care, you learn to read the body language of strangers faster than most people. You learn to recognize when someone is walking toward you with bad intentions. She rose to her feet. The first man had already reached the bodyguard. Fast. 1 punch. The bodyguard went down. The second man headed straight for Catalina. "Zoe," Catalina shouted. "Come here. Right now." Zoe turned, saw Catalina's face, and a child's instinct made her run to her at once without asking why. Catalina pushed both girls behind her. Her back faced the man advancing toward them. Her arms spread wide on either side, completely shielding the 2 small bodies behind her. The man stopped 3 steps away, "Come with me," he said, his voice low. "Don't make it difficult and no one gets hurt." Catalina didn't move. Instead, she did the only thing she could do in that moment. She screamed. Screamed as loud as she could. Not a scream of fear, but a scream with purpose, sharp and piercing, cutting through the noise of the park and striking everyone around them. "Help! Someone call 911. Help!" Heads turned. Phones went up. A jogger stopped. A couple taking photographs swung their camera toward them. A ripple of alarm spread outward like water. The man looked around. Too many eyes. Too many cameras. He stepped back once, looked at his partner dragging the bodyguard off the path. Then both men turned, moved quickly back to the SUV, got in, slammed the doors, and drove away, gone. Catalina was still standing there. Her arms were still spread. Her back was still shielding the girls. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, in her throat, in her fingertips. Zoe was crying behind her, loud, panicked sobs. But Maddie wasn't crying. She was clutching Catalina's shirt with both hands, trembling from head to toe, but not making a sound. Exactly like that night in the bedroom, when she had held her teddy bear and sat in silence. Maddie didn't cry when she was afraid. She held on to the person she trusted most. Catalina dropped to her knees and gathered both girls into her arms, holding them tightly, then reached for the phone from the pocket of the bodyguard lying on the grass. She dialed the only number she remembered besides emergency services. Flynn. Her voice was calm in a way that felt almost unnatural. Millennium Park. Someone just tried to get close to the girls. The bodyguard is down. The girls are safe. I kept them safe. She stopped, and on that last sentence, her voice trembled. Only a little. Just enough for Flynn to hear it. Just enough for him to understand that her calmness didn't mean she wasn't afraid, but that she didn't have the right to be afraid, while two little girls were clutching her shirt. Easton reached Millennium Park in less than 12 minutes after Flynn's call. When he stepped out of the car, he saw Catalina sitting on the grass holding both girls, with 2 police cars nearby and a cluster of curious onlookers standing around filming on their phones. He didn't look at the police. He didn't look at the crowd. He walked straight to the 3 of them, dropped to his knees, and for the first time gathered all 3 into his arms at once without anyone asking him to. Zoe was still hiccuping through her sobs. Maddie was still clutching Catalina's shirt, and Catalina looked at him with calm eyes. But beneath that calm, he recognized something only someone who had once lived in fear could recognize in another person. The exhaustion of someone who had just used every ounce of strength to keep herself from falling apart in front of 2 children. He took the 3 of them back to the penthouse immediately, not through the main elevator. The private elevator from the garage went straight to the 47th floor. Once inside the apartment, he led them through the hallway, past the study, to the steel door hidden behind the paneled wood wall that no one in the house knew about except him and Flynn. The safe room, steel-lined walls, an independent ventilation system, water and dry food for 3 days, a small bed, blankets, pillows. Easton set the girls on the bed and pulled the blanket over them. Zoe clung to Catalina's hand and wouldn't let go. "Cat is here," Catalina whispered, smoothing the little girl's hair. "Cat isn't going anywhere." Easton stood in the doorway of the safe room, looked at the 3 of them, then spoke to Catalina in a voice she had never heard him use before. Not the voice of an employer, not the voice of a mafia boss, but the voice of a frightened father. "Lock the door from the inside. Don't open it for anyone except me. I'll knock 3 times, then 2. Catalina nodded. Easton stepped out. The steel door closed. The sound of the lock turning from the inside echoed, and the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago became the thing he was best at being, a predator. Flynn was already waiting in the study. On the desk sat an open laptop, the call log, the security camera data. "The bodyguard has a broken jaw, but he'll live," Flynn said. "The 2 men in the park still haven't been identified, but the SUV was rented under a false name through a company on the south side of the city." The south side. Paxton Hale's territory. Easton's jaw tightened, but Paxton wouldn't suddenly know about the safe, or the nanny, Flynn continued, his voice careful. "Someone in this house gave him the information." He turned the laptop toward Easton and replayed the recorded call that Greyfield Holdings security had intercepted from the building's internal network. Neil Ashford's voice came through, clear and unmistakable. "The nanny. She saw inside Greyfield's personal safe. Fake passports. Cash. She knows enough to destroy him." Easton listened to the end. Switched the machine off. Silence. Flynn had worked for Easton long enough to know that when his employer went silent after hearing news like this, it didn't mean he was calm. It meant he was at his most dangerous. "Bring Ashford up here," Easton said, his voice flat as water before a storm. Neil appeared 10 minutes later. Gray suit, slicked back hair, his face wearing the same polite expression as always. He stepped into the study with the confidence of a man who didn't yet know he had been exposed. "You wanted to see me, sir?" Easton sat behind the desk. He didn't stand. He didn't invite Neil to sit. "Do you know what I hate most, Neil?" Neil tilted his head slightly, still holding on to that practiced professional courtesy. "Sir, betrayal. One word." And the way Easton said it, slow, quiet, clear on every syllable, made the skin at the back of Neil's neck rise. "You sold information about the woman who was protecting my children." It wasn't a question. Neil's face changed. The polite mask peeled away in less than a second, and beneath it was what he had hidden for 3 years. Calculation, cowardice, and now fear. "Mr. Greyfield, I can explain." "You can." Easton cut in, his voice never rising even a little. "But I don't care." He looked at Flynn, gave a single nod. Flynn stepped to Neil's side, and Easton spoke the last sentence he would ever say to his butler, in the tone any man in Chicago's underworld would understand for what it truly meant. "Take him away. Make sure he understands this is the only conversation I'm going to have with him." Neil opened his mouth. No sound came out. Flynn caught his arm, led him to the door. The door closed behind them, and Neil Ashford disappeared from the penthouse on the 47th floor forever, in the same way the people who betrayed Easton Greyfield always disappeared, quietly, completely, and without anyone asking another question. 3 a.m. The penthouse was silent. The immediate threat had been dealt with, but Easton knew Paxton Hale wasn't the kind of man who gave up after one failed attempt. There would be more to handle. But not tonight. Tonight, he walked to the steel door hidden behind the wood panel. Knocked 3 times. Paused. Then 2. The lock opened from the inside. The door cracked open. Catalina looked at him through the narrow opening, then pulled it wider. Inside, Zoe and Maddie lay curled together on the small bed, blankets up to their chins, their tiny faces peaceful in sleep. But Catalina wasn't lying on the bed. She was sitting on the floor, her back against the steel wall right beside it, in the exact position where anyone stepping through that door would have to get through her before they could reach the girls. Her eyes were open. She wasn't sleeping. She was standing guard. Easton stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Then he sat down on the floor opposite her in the narrow space, his back against the steel wall on the other side. Their knees nearly touched. "You aren't sleeping," he said softly. "No, it's handled. It's safe now." Catalina gave a small nod, but she didn't change her position. She stayed exactly where she was, still sitting there, still guarding. Easton looked at her in the dim glow of the emergency light on the ceiling. "You could have run," he said, his voice lower now. "At the park, when they came. You could have run." Catalina looked at him, then at the girls, asleep on the bed. "Run where?" she asked, her voice light, but steady as steel. "My whole life, people have walked away. Everyone. Foster families walked away. Friends walked away. You sent me away too." She paused. "I will never be the one who walks away." Silence. Easton didn't answer, because there were no words large enough. He reached out his hand, slowly, placed it over the back of hers where it rested on her knee. He didn't grip. He didn't pull. He only laid it there, gently. Catalina looked at his hand on top of hers. She didn't pull away. And in that steel-lined safe room in the heart of Chicago, where the walls were thick enough to stop bullets and the door heavy enough to stop a bomb, Easton Greyfield felt truly safe for the first time in his life, not because of the steel walls, not because of the coded lock, but because of the woman sitting across from him, the woman he had wronged, driven away, nearly lost, who was sitting here in the middle of the night guarding his daughters with her whole life. In the days after Millennium Park, the penthouse changed in ways no amount of money could ever buy. Security tripled. Flynn placed men on every floor. New cameras were installed all through the hallways, and Paxton Hale received a message from Easton that no one but the 2 of them knew the contents of. But the result was that no black SUV ever appeared near Greyfield Tower or anywhere the girls went again. But the greatest change wasn't the security. It was Easton. He came home at 5 o'clock. Every day. Not 5:30, not 6 if I can make it. 5 o'clock, exactly on time. As if someone had drawn a line and he had promised himself he would never step past it again. He sat at the dinner table with the girls and Catalina. 4 people, 4 plates. Vera cooked more than before, because now there was someone actually eating at the table instead of just taking a plate into the study. And after dinner, Easton read to the girls before bed. The first night was a disaster. He held the book upside down. Zoe noticed immediately and burst out laughing. "Daddy, the book is upside down." He turned it around and started to read, but his voice was used to giving orders to hundreds of people. And now the sentence, "The little bear walked into the forest," sounded like a declaration of war. Maddie looked at her father with wide eyes, then tugged Catalina's hand where she stood by the bedroom door. "Cat reads better," she whispered, loud enough for Easton to hear. He looked at his daughter, then at Catalina, and instead of getting angry or embarrassed, he did something Catalina had never seen before. He smiled, just slightly. Only one corner of his mouth lifted a little. But it was a real smile, not calculated, not controlled. Just a clumsy father trying and knowing he wasn't good at it yet. "Daddy will practice more," he told Maddie. On the second night, he read a little better. On the third night, Zoe started leaning against his shoulder, instead of only sitting across from him. On the fourth night, Maddie held out her teddy bear for him to hold while she listened to the story, and Catalina stood outside the door and understood that this was the greatest act of trust that quiet little child could offer anyone. On a Friday evening, the girls were asleep. Catalina stood on the penthouse balcony. Lake Michigan stretched below like a vast black mirror reflecting the city lights. The wind was light. The sky was clear. She heard footsteps behind her and knew who it was without turning around. Easton stood beside her. Both hands rested on the railing. The two of them looked out over the lake in silence for a long time. Not an uncomfortable silence. The kind of silence shared by two people beginning to grow used to each other's presence without needing to fill it with words. Then Easton spoke, his voice low, his eyes still on the water. "My wife died giving birth to the girls." Catalina didn't turn, didn't ask anything. She only listened. Complications. "The doctor called me at 2 a.m. At that moment, I was down at the South Harbor." He stopped. "A meeting," he said, and from the way he pressed those 2 words, Catalina understood that meeting didn't mean a conference room with a projection screen. "By the time I reached the hospital, it was over. The girls were in incubators, and he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The wind off Lake Michigan moved through their hair." Catalina waited. "I wasn't there," Easton said, and those 4 words carried the weight of 4 years of guilt. "My wife left this world alone, and my daughters came into it without their father beside them." His hands tightened on the railing. "I built this whole empire," he said, his voice rougher now. "Everything. The money, the power, the building, the network. I built all of it so I'd never have to feel helpless again. So no one could ever take anything from me again." He turned to look at Catalina for the first time since he had begun speaking. "But I was still helpless in the face of the thing that mattered most. I still wasn't home when my daughters needed me. I still didn't know my little girl is afraid of bread crusts. I still left a loaded gun within their reach." Catalina looked at him. Her brown eyes were calm. But beneath that calm was something softer. Something she had been trying not to let herself feel ever since returning to this house. Because feeling it would make everything more complicated 1,000 times over. "You're here now," she said, gently, "every night. That's what the girls need most. Not the empire, not the money, just their father here." Easton looked at her, and she saw something in those gray eyes she had never seen before. Not control, not calculation, not anger, but gratitude. Real, deep. The kind of gratitude a man like Easton Greyfield didn't know how to express in words because he had never had to express it before. "Catalina." She startled a little, not because his voice was loud, but because it was the first time, the very first time since she had stepped into this house 2 years earlier, that he had called her by her name. Not Miss Herrera, not the nanny, not you, but Catalina, just Catalina. "You're the best person my daughters have ever known." He paused. The wind blew. The lake shimmered below. Then he added, more quietly, as if he were saying this for the first time not only to her but to himself as well. "And you're the best person I've ever known too." Catalina didn't answer. She turned and looked out at Lake Michigan. But under the city lights, Easton saw the corner of her mouth lift slightly, so faintly it was almost invisible, and on the balcony of the 47th floor, in the Chicago night wind, the distance between the Mafia boss and the nanny narrowed a little more, not because either of them stepped closer, but because for the first time, neither of them stepped back. One Sunday afternoon, the kitchen table in the penthouse turned into a battlefield of colored paper, safety scissors, glue, and glitter scattered all over the marble surface that was usually polished so perfectly it could reflect a person's face. Catalina sat between the girls, guiding Zoe's hands as she cut flower petals from a sheet of pink paper, while Maddie carefully folded each small petal on her own from the purple paper she liked best. The paper flower project had been Catalina's idea. Each girl would make one flower for the person she wanted to give it to. Zoe worked fast, her flower large, the petals slightly uneven, glue smeared over the edges, glitter spilling all across the table. She didn't care about perfection. She cared about speed. Done. Zoe held up the pink flower, the glue still wet and dripping. For Daddy, Catalina smiled. Why for Daddy? Zoe tilted her head as if the answer were far too obvious. Because Daddy is sad a lot. 4 words. So simple they were cruel. Because a 4-year-old child doesn't know how to lie about feelings. She only says what she sees. And what Zoe had seen through all 4 years of her life was a father who was powerful but sad, wealthy but lonely, always in control of everything except the pain inside himself. Maddie stayed quiet beside them, focused on her small purple flower. She worked much more slowly than Zoe. Each petal folded twice, glued carefully, pressed lightly until it lay flat, before she moved on to the next one. Her flower was smaller than Zoe's, with no glitter, nothing flashy, but neat and careful in the way only Maddie could make it. When she finished, she didn't hold it up and shout the way her sister had. She held the flower in the palm of her hand, looked at it for a moment, then lifted her eyes to Catalina. For Cat. Catalina tilted her head a little. For Cat? Why not for Daddy or for Zoe? Maddie shook her head gently. Then she spoke, her voice small but clear, each word chosen carefully in the way this quiet child always chose her words. Because no one ever gives Cat flowers. Catalina didn't react right away. She sat there looking at the little purple flower in Maddie's hand, and something inside her chest tightened so sharply that she had to turn her face away, just for a second. Long enough to blink, long enough to swallow down whatever was rising in her throat. Then she turned back, smiled, and took the flower from Maddie's hand. It's beautiful, sweetheart. Her voice was warm, but a little rough around the edges. Easton stood by the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee in his hand, and he had seen everything. He had seen Catalina turn her face away, seen the moment she tried to hold back tears, seen the small purple flower in his daughter's hand, and understood that Maddie was right. Catalina Herrera, 27 years in this world, had never once been given flowers. Never. Zoe ran to her father and shoved the pink flower, sticky with smeared glue, into his hand. Yours. Easton took the flower. It weighed almost nothing. Glue stuck to his fingers. Glitter fell onto the sleeve of his suit, and he held it as though he were holding the most precious thing he had ever touched, because that was exactly what it was. The safe in his study held millions of dollars in cash. This paper flower held something money could never buy. Daddy, do you know what's more important than money? Zoe asked, her face lifted, blue eyes looking up at him expectantly. Easton looked down at his daughter, then looked up, looked at Catalina standing by the table, the small purple flower resting in her palm, the rims of her eyes still faintly red. I do, he said, and the way he said those 2 words, the way his eyes rested on Catalina longer than they rested on the flower, made Catalina have to look away again. Maddie slipped down from her chair, walked around the table to Catalina, stood in front of her, and said a sentence no 4-year-old child should have had the power to say. Yet Maddie Greyfield said it in the most ordinary voice in the world. This is Cat's family. Catalina stood still, the purple flower in her hand, and the word family echoed through the kitchen and settled somewhere inside her chest, in the place that had been empty for all 27 years of her life. She had heard that word countless times, in books, in films, in those mandatory counseling sessions during foster care, but never had anyone spoken that word and aimed it toward her. Never had anyone looked at her and said, "This is your family," and truly meant it. Not until today. Not until Maddie. Easton set his coffee cup down on the counter, walked to the table, pulled out a chair and sat down beside Catalina. Close. Closer than ever before. Then he reached out and took her hand, the hand still holding the little purple flower. He held it gently, didn't squeeze, didn't pull, just held it, in front of his daughters, without hiding it. Zoe's eyes went wide, then she burst out in the most excited voice she had. "Daddy is holding Kat's hand!" Maddie didn't shout. She only looked at the two grown-up hands joined together, then smiled. A small smile. Rare, quiet, but brighter than any paper flower on the table. And in the kitchen on the 47th floor, the kitchen that only weeks ago had witnessed everything falling apart, it was now witnessing something beginning, something as fragile as a paper petal, yet more real than any $1 million contract Easton Greyfield had ever signed. A few months passed, and the penthouse on the 47th floor was no longer a home. Easton sold it at the beginning of spring, quietly, without any advance announcement, just one phone call to Flynn, and everything was arranged within 2 weeks. No one in Chicago real estate understood why the chief executive officer of Greyfield Holdings was giving up the symbolic penthouse at the top of the tower that carried his own name. But Easton offered no explanation, and no one dared ask. The new house was in the western suburbs of Chicago, a quiet area where streets had names instead of numbers, where neighbors waved to each other every morning, and children rode their bikes along the sidewalks without needing bodyguards beside them. It was a 2-story house with white brick walls, a gray roof, a wide front porch with a porch swing, and a backyard that stretched out with green grass, a low wooden fence, and wild daisy bushes growing freely along the stone path. There was no bulletproof glass, no steel-lined safe room, no safe. Easton had removed everything. The safe, the fake passports, the cash, the Beretta, all of it disappeared along with the old life he was slowly dismantling. The process of stepping away from the underworld wasn't fast, and it wasn't easy. And Flynn still had to deal with the remaining loose ends every week. But the direction was clear now, and no one, not even Paxton Hale, dared challenge Easton's decision while he still had enough power to make things very unpleasant for anyone who stood in his way. On the first spring afternoon in the new house, Easton stood on the front porch with his back against a wooden post, a cup of coffee in his hand, and looked out over the yard. The scene before him was so simple it was almost absurd when compared to the life he had lived only a few months earlier. Catalina sat on the grass with her legs stretched out, her black hair falling over her shoulders, surrounded by a pile of daisies Zoe had picked. The girls were stringing the flowers into crowns. Catalina was showing Zoe how to weave the stems together while Maddie worked slowly on her own, her tongue sticking out to one side in concentration, exactly the way it had when she buttoned her shirt by herself for the first time. The late afternoon sun covered the three of them in a pale golden light, and Easton stood there watching, the coffee slowly cooling in his hand, thinking about everything he had nearly lost. If Zoe hadn't told the truth that morning, if he hadn't found the notebook, if he hadn't driven to the bus stop on Michigan Avenue, if Catalina had stepped onto that last bus and vanished into the city without looking back, if his arrogance had been stronger than the sound of Maddie's crying in her sleep at 2 a.m, then he would be standing on that porch alone now, and the girls would be growing up without the woman sitting on the grass out there, the woman who had saved his daughters from the gun, who had taught them dignity, who had protected them with her own body in the park, and who had forgiven him when he hadn't deserved it. Maddie stood up and ran to the porch, a tiny daisy crown in her hand. She climbed the 2 steps and stood in front of her father, lifting her chin to look up at him. For Daddy. Easton took the flower crown. It weighed almost nothing. A few petals had already wilted. The stems were woven unevenly, but he held it with both hands as if it were the most fragile thing in the world. For me? Maddie nodded, then said in the clearest voice she had, "Because Daddy said sorry." The little girl paused for a second. Kat says the person who knows how to say sorry is the strongest person. Easton looked at his daughter, 4 years old, and she had just said the thing most grown adults spend their entire lives failing to understand. He looked down at the crown in his hands, then out into the yard where Catalina was helping Zoe finish the last flower chain. Zoe completed her creation, held it up proudly, then ran up to the porch, her blonde hair flying in the sunlight. "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy," she panted. "I made this for Kat, but Kat said I had to wear it too, so I put it on. Do I look pretty?" She spun in a circle, the flower crown tilting sideways on her head. Then she stopped, looked at her father, looked at Catalina walking up the porch steps behind her. then turned back to Easton with the most serious blue eyes a 4-year-old child could possibly have. Daddy. Is Kat our new mommy? The air on the porch went still. Catalina had just reached the final step when she heard that question, and her foot froze in the middle of the motion. Color rushed into her cheeks, quick and unmistakable. The kind of blush that couldn't be hidden no matter where she turned her face. She looked down, at the grass, at anything except Easton. Easton looked at Catalina. She stood there on the step, the late afternoon sun laying gold across her black hair, a few daisy petals clinging to her shirt, her cheeks pink, her eyes lowered, and he thought that in all the things he had ever seen in his life, from million-dollar boardrooms to midnight docks, nothing had ever been as beautiful as this woman standing in the spring sunlight with wild daisies on her clothes. He smiled. A real smile. The kind of smile Zoe and Maddie rarely saw, and Catalina had never seen. Not the controlled half-smile of a man managing a room, just Easton's smile. Only Easton, with no boss, no chief executive officer, no walls. "Ask Kat," he said to Zoe, his eyes still on Catalina. Zoe turned to Catalina immediately, without hesitation, because children don't know how to be shy when it comes to asking the most important questions. "Kat? Are you our new mommy?" Catalina looked at Zoe, looked at Maddie standing beside her father, her hand gripping his pant leg, blue eyes waiting. Then she looked at Easton. And in those gray eyes, she no longer saw the boss. She no longer saw her employer. She no longer saw the man who had thrown her out into the Chicago night. She saw the man who had driven to find her, who had turned on her heated seat when she was cold, who had read bedtime stories to his daughters every night in that awkward voice of his, who had taken her hand in front of his children without hesitation, who had left an empire behind to buy a house with a yard and a porch swing. "I'm already here," she said. Gently. Zoe let out a delighted squeal. Maddie smiled. That rare smile of hers, but the brightest one she had. And Easton Greyfield stood on the porch of the new house with a daisy crown in his hand, looking at the 3 most important people in his life, and understood that he had finally found the one thing his entire underground empire had never been able to give him, a real home. And that is the story of Easton Greyfield, Catalina Herrera, and 2 little girls with their wild daisy flowers. Sometimes we believe strength lives in power, in money, in the ability to control everything around us. But life always finds a way to teach us the opposite, that the smallest person can sometimes teach us the greatest lesson. An orphaned nanny, with nothing but her dignity, changed an entire house. 2 4-year-old children, who only wanted to be loved, changed an entire human being. And a powerful mafia boss had to face the arrogance inside himself before he could finally understand that a person's true worth isn't found inside a safe, but in the way you treat those who have no power to fight back against you. Because money can be lost and earned again. But dignity, that is something that has to be protected every single day. If this story touched your heart, if it made you stop for even 1 second to think about the way you treat the people around you, then please press the like button. Share this video with someone you love. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, subscribe now so we can keep listening together to more meaningful stories every day. We would truly love to hear from you. How did this story make you feel? Which moment moved you the most? And in real life, have you ever judged someone before giving them the chance to speak for themselves? Please share what you feel from the deepest place in your heart in the comment section below, because every story that is shared can change someone's heart. Hello, everyone. I wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and calm. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.